In this video, we're going to do all the service processes for the front axle out of a Mahindra Roxor. Start by removing the cotter keys from the tie rod ends. Once the cotter keys are removed, use a 19mm socket and remove the nuts. Using a 2-jaw puller, remove the tie rods from the knuckles. We do not offer this 2-jaw puller, but it is an OTC part with part number 4520. Using a 10mm Allen, remove the drain plug and drain the differential into a drain bucket. Using a 12mm socket, remove the differential cover bolts. Gently strike with a soft hammer to break the seal of the silicone from the housing. Pry away from housing as necessary. Using a 19mm socket, remove the brake caliper bracket bolts. Pry off the hubcap. Remove the axle shaft snap ring. Using a 9/16 socket, remove the drive flange bolts. Once removed, use a chisel and a punch to release the locking mechanism from the hub nut. Using a QT1011, remove the inner and outer hub nut. After the first one is removed, remove the locking washer. We will now remove the hub assembly. Remove the 6 9/16 bolts that hold on the spindle assembly. Once the spindle is removed, remove the axle shaft. Remove the cotter key from the upper ball joint nut. Using an 1 7/16 socket, remove the upper ball joint nut. Using an 1 1/8, remove the lower ball joint nut. Using the same 2-jaw puller previously cited, use that to unseat the upper and lower ball joints and remove the knuckle. Using a QT 1075, remove the upper ball joint insert from the housing. Repeat this process on the other side. Properly mark each side of the differential bearing caps for reassembly. Using a 19mm socket, remove the bearing cap bolts. Using a differential case spreader, QT 1032, gently spread the case 20 thousandths of an inch or less to get the third member out. Using a QK4647, drive out the inner axle seals. Using an inch and an eighth socket, remove the pinion nut. Pull off the pinion flange using the puller included in kit number QT9308I. Using a punch and a hammer, drive out the pinion from the housing. Using a seal puller, remove the pinion seal this time. Once the pinion seal is removed, remove the outer pinion bearing baffle and the outer pinion bearing itself. Using a punch, drive out the inner and outer pinion bearing cups. Keep track of the shims you remove and where they came from. Using a silicone remover, remove the silicone from the sealing surface and clean the differential housing. Using a TS4821 ball joint press kit, press out the old ball joints. Using the same TS4821 ball joint press kit, press in the new ball joints into the knuckle. We will now replace the axle shaft U-joints. Start by removing the U-joint retainer clips. Once the clips are removed, we will then press out the U-joint caps one at a time using the TS3083 ball joint press. When pressing in the new U-joint into the axle shaft, press the U-joint about a 1/4 inch past where the U-joint retainer clip goes. This will allow the needle bearings to be engaged on both sides of the axle shaft to avoid damaging any of the U-joint caps. Using a blind hole puller, remove first the spindle seal and then remove the bushing for the spindle. We will now replace the wheel bearings. Start by removing the outer wheel bearing, the spacer, and the shims from the hub. We will now pound out the inner wheel bearing and seal. Using an adequate punch, pound out the wheel bearing cups. Remove the 5 15mm bolts that hold the rotor to the hub. Repeat this process with the other hub. Using a QT1229 differential bearing puller, remove the differential side bearings from the carrier. Be sure to notate shims removed and which side they came from. Repeat this process on the other differential side bearing. Using a 17mm socket, remove the left-hand thread ring gear bolts. Place a block of wood or something soft underneath it and gently strike off the ring gear with a soft hammer. Drive out the locking pin from the carrier and remove the center pin that holds in the spider gears. Strike out if necessary. Now remove the spider gears one at a time, being sure that you also get the thrust washers with them. Inspect the parts for abnormal wear. Once clean, lubricate and reinstall the spider gears. Line up the spider gears so the center shaft can be reinstalled. Be sure to line up the locking hole with where the locking pin goes in the carrier. Tap in as needed with a soft hammer, being sure not to damage or create any burrs. Make sure the spider gears move freely. Using new ring gear bolts, reinstall the ring gear onto the carrier. Run the ring gear bolts down and do an initial torque of 22 foot-pounds, followed by 44 foot-pounds, and followed by a final torque of 66 foot-pounds. Using QT1229 differential bearing puller, remove the inner pinion bearing from the pinion. Install new wheel bearing cups into the hub. The new wheel bearings and cups and seals are included in kit number TK4785. Both wheel bearing cups will use the same driver, part number QT1802. Properly lubricate and pack the wheel bearings before installation. The wheel bearing packer showed in this video is part number QT5500. Install the grease seal on the back of the hub. Use a flat driver to install this seal. Once installed, put the rotor onto the hub and torque these bolts to somewhere between 60 and 65 foot-pounds. The torque spec is not listed according to Mahindra. We will now install the outer wheel bearing, the shim, and the spacer. Repeat this process for the other hub. Install new spindle seal and V-wiper onto the back of the spindle included in kit number TK4017. Repeat process for both sides. Install new inner pinion bearing using tool QT1044. The new pinion bearing seal and the rest of the differential bearings can be found in kit number TK4043. Remember, before pressing on the differential side bearings, be sure to reinstall any shims that were removed. We will now install the inner axle seals. The seals, the tool, are both included in kit number QK4872. using QT1119 driver installer handle and cup number QT1818, install the inner pinion bearing cup with the shims behind it. We will use the same installer and driver for the outer pinion bearing as well. The pinion bearings, cups, and the rest of the differential bearings can be found in kit number TK4043. Install the pinion into the housing, being sure to place on any spacers or shims that were previously on the pinion. Once that's in place, install the outer pinion bearing onto the pinion shaft. Install the outer pinion bearing slinger, the pinion seal, and the flange. Push the flange on far enough until the nut can get started. Tighten the pinion bearing until 6 to 9 inches of preload is achieved for a used pinion and 14 to 19 for a new pinion. Spread the case approximately 0.010 of an inch according to a dial indicator. This should be enough to get the carrier into the housing. Strike with a soft hammer as needed to fully seat the carrier into the housing. Recall the marks you made previously on the bearing caps to install them in the correct orientation and placement. Once installed, torque the bearing cap bolts between 65 and 74 foot-pounds. Check the backlash. It should be between 5 and 10 thousandths.
Thousandths of backlash.
Using socket part number QT1075, install the upper ball joint insert. Install the axle shaft into the housing. Install the V-seal onto the axle shaft. Put anti-seize around the surface of the spindle and grease the inner spindle bushing. Once the spindle is on and tight, install the hub onto the spindle. Remember to install this spacer between the wheel bearings and the shims that were previously installed. After that, the outer wheel bearing will go on. And the wheel bearing washer, and then the wheel bearing nut. Torque the inner wheel bearing nut between 60 and 80 foot-pounds. Check the end of the hub for about 1/1000th of end play. Be sure to rotate as you torque down the hub nut. The outer hub nut has the same torque spec of 60 to 80 foot-pounds. Once this is torqued, bend the locking tabs on the washer to lock both nuts into place. Grease and install the drive flange onto the hub. Tighten the 15mm bolts and then install the snap ring onto the axle shaft to hold the axle shaft into the drive flange. After this, install the hubcap using a proper ball joint socket. Install the brake caliper back onto the housing using the 19mm bolts. Torque these bolts to between 57 and 65 foot-pounds. Install the 12mm differential cover bolts, sealing it with silicone. Once the silicone has had adequate time to dry, fill the differential with recommended fluid. Install the tie rods back into the knuckles using the 19mm nuts previously removed. Tighten adequately and be sure to align the line in the castle nut with the hole in the tie rod to install the cotter.